Welcome back to WordPress widgets front to back. At this point, we've made major progress on our widget. We've got it showing up in the WordPress dashboard, we're able to drag it into sidebar areas, and we've even got it loading style sheets and JavaScript files. At this point, it's time to begin adding admin options. So in this screencast, we're going to add a text field that will allow a user to specify their name. We'll take a look at how we're going to create the views and the markup for doing that, and we'll talk about how we're going to render that in the sidebar of the theme. So let's get started. Assuming you have your web server running, CodeKit running, and the rest of your tools, go ahead and hop into your IDE. Recall from a previous screencast that the form function is what will allow us to create our views for the admin panel of our widget. Now there's two ways in which you can go about developing your form. First, you can write all of your markup here in this function, in this file, or you can create a separate file that contains just the markup. I'm a fan of trying to keep files as separated as possible because I believe in separation of concerns. This means that as much as possible, I try to keep markup in separate files, PHP in its own file, style sheets in their own file, and JavaScript in their own file. This is not a requirement for developing a widget, however, it is a practice that I have adopted and that I believe to be more maintainable while building WordPress widgets. So, the first thing that we want to do is create a views directory. This is where we'll add our admin file. We'll call it admin.php, as well as our widget file. Both of these will be used to render the admin panel and the public-facing side of the widget. So first, let's go ahead and populate the admin file with just some test data. Next, return to plugin.php, and we want to make a call to include. And we want to make a call to PHP's include function to load our admin view. So save your work, return to the browser. Now take front to back and drag it into the sidebar. If all goes well, you should see the sentence that we wrote in the admin.php file. That's great. That means that we're properly loading our admin view. Let's return to the IDE and then begin to work with the instance of this particular widget. Remember, this is where the values will be set. The first thing that we want to do is initialize default values for the widget. In order to do that, we'll create a variable called instance. We are going to be using the same variable name that is passed into this form. This keeps the code cleaner, and it will leverage the values that are being passed into this function. We'll make a call to wp parse args. This function accepts two arguments. The first argument is an array of values that currently exist on an object, and the second is an array of default values. So in keeping with our clean code formatting, let's pass the instance that's coming in to the form function as an array. Note that I'm casting the object as an array as the first argument. Next, I pass a second array. This is where the values are initialized. We'll say that we're going to call this the name field, and we'll initialize it with an empty string. Next, let's open up views admin.php so that we can begin actually working with this value. Now, when writing views, I like to wrap all of my content into its own container so that I can access them easily when using styles. So to do this, I'll create a div and I will give it a class front to back. Now here's the important thing to note. I'm using a class and not an ID because people can use multiple instances of this widget. If you have an ID and you have multiple instances of a widget, then you're going to be abusing the markup. Next, let's create a label so that users know exactly what we're asking them for. In this case, we're asking them for their first name. Now, I'm not going to be using straight up HTML here. Instead, I'm going to embed a PHP tag and I'm going to use the WordPress E function. Notice that it's preceded by an underscore. Similar to the underscore function, this function is also a localization function, except it means echo the current string that you're passing in. So we'll say your name, and then we'll pass in front to back. We'll close the PHP tag, we'll close the label, we'll save our work, return to the browser, refresh, put front to back here in the sidebar, and there's your label. At this point, let's add an input element so that users will be able to actually put their name in. To do this, return to your IDE and then return to admin in the views directory. Next, let's go ahead and stub out our input element. It's going to be of type text. It will have an ID, it will have a name, and it will have a value. Now I want to talk about each of these attributes separately. WordPress has several helper functions that are designed to make it easy to work with multiple input elements with the same ID, even though there's multiple instances. By this, I mean that if you drag a front-to-back widget into the sidebar and it has an ID, and then you drag a second front-to-back element into the sidebar and it has an ID, WordPress will take care of it to make sure that there's no conflicts. In order to do this, we need to make a call to these WordPress helper functions. So for the ID, we'll make a call to a function named getFieldID. First, you'll open your PHP and close your PHP tags, and then you'll echo back this getFieldID name. Note that because we're making a call to this, however, the function does not live within our class. Instead, it inherits this functionality from the WP widget class that our widget is extending. Next, the ID that we pass is that of the name. That's the key of the array that we've defined in the plugin and how we're going to be identifying the user's name. For the name field, there's a similar function, however, it's called getFieldName. So let's add that now. Next, the last thing we need to do is to be able to actually show the user's name in the value of the text field. To do that, we can simply reference the instance variable that we've defined in the plugin. Notice that I've opened and closed my PHP tags and I'm echoing instance name. Now, return to plugin.php and recall that because the admin view is called after the instance variable is created, it actually has access to it. Because the key is name, we're able to access it in the markup. Next, return to your browser, refresh, and then you should see a new input element. So let's go ahead and define our name. Notice that it doesn't save it. Recall from a previous screencast that there is a function in the WordPress Widgets API that is specifically responsible for updating values in the database. Return to your IDE and then locate the update function. This is where we need to work with serialization. Recall that the new instance will contain the values that the user has just put in the input field, and the old instance will be the current values. Because we're initializing our widget with a value for name, even if it's empty, it will always have it. So what we'll do is we'll say old instance name equals new instance's name. Finally, we'll return old instance. Whenever you're done with your update function, you need to always return the array after the values have been updated. So let's save, return to our browser, refresh the page, and then let's try saving our name again. If all goes well and you've correctly written your update function, then after you click save, your name should persist. Next, clear out the value and click save. Notice that the value persists once again. This means that we've successfully added a text field and we're saving it to the database. Although there's more work to do, such as displaying the widget on the front end of the site and adding some additional elements onto the screen, we need to talk about data sanitization. So in the next screencast, we're going to take a look at some of the security functions that WordPress provides to make sure that we're able to sanitize our data whenever we're writing to the database and reading from the database. Can't wait to get started, and I'll see you in the next screencast.